This is all right. Hi.
Hi.
It's so good to be here with you on this lunchtime chat. Thank you for taking time out of your busy day to be with us.
Yes, of course. Thank you for having me. I'm excited to meet you. I think we have so much in common in our professional interests.
Yeah, I mean, well, it's funny, right? Because we connected on Instagram. We also have a very dear friend in Hina, Dr. Hina, who I've known since college, but then reconnected kind of over some of the stuff that we were doing in children's health. And I am such an admirer of what you're doing on Instagram and for children's health publicly. So if you don't mind, just give us an introduction, and then I'm going to keep going deeper into your personal story. But please go ahead, Dr. Kelly.
Sure. I'm a pediatrician. I went to Columbia Medical School and stayed on for my training in the Bronx at Montefiore Children's Hospital. There, I stayed on the faculty for many years, focusing on children with complex medical issues. But when I had little kids of my own, I wanted something with a little bit more family friendly nature. So I switched to working for the Department of Health and Public Health in the South Bronx in sort of
Oh, I
a
didn't know that. That's so
safety net
interesting.
program. Yeah, it was for children who had chronic health conditions in the school system. So I went from having like 100 patients to having like 120,000 patients and a database to try to see who was missing school and who was sick and a backpack. And I would like go out and find these kids and try to help them. So that was really fun until the pandemic hit and they were like, now you're a COVID swabber instead. And I was like, I don't want to be a COVID swabber. um,
Yeah.
so I left my role there and wrote a book about the pandemic. And then I came back to private practice while I was planning to write this book, Advanced Parenting. And now I'm at Atria, which is like a whole nother exciting thing.
Yeah. So you've seen so many sides of it. I think that when I became a parent, I don't know, it's like obviously everyone goes through this identity change, and then you go through the first 0 to 18 months, and you're like, oh, I think I got this, right? Like, I think I get kids. And then there's all these different angles that come at you. And I feel like one of the things that you're offering in this book is for the people that have stuff come at them. And I think I'll share a little bit more of my story as we go on. But as you know, my one of my kids has a very kind of acute medical situation. But this book is not actually just for people like me. It's actually for a huge, huge group of parents. And I would love for you to explain what the inspiration behind the book is and who those parents are, so that we can debunk this thing that it's only for, only some kids go through some stuff.
Yes, it's funny when I first was having conversations with my agent about this book. They wanted me to call it a caregiving book and not a parenting book because it's true that it is in some ways there's a parallel to the caregiving that people do for their elderly parents, navigating appointments in the healthcare system and all that sort of stuff. But what I didn't like about that approach was that I think that most parents at some point have to use caregiving skills in parenting their child. Um, you know, you read a regular parenting book and you're trying to get your child to sleep or to potty train or to eat a variety of foods and the typical advice doesn't work for you. Then you all of a sudden have to like tap into another skill set of how to evaluate the situation, educate yourself about whether or not your child is kind of following a typical pathway or needs additional assistance, research the system to learn like what resources might be available to you and most accessible and would best fit your family's needs. And so, when you include those sorts of things in this conversation, I think that what it also does is it helps that all parents to be more empathetic to the parents who are using these skills even more than that. There are obviously
Yeah.
parents who like 23 hours a day are using these caregiving skills. And I hope that in writing this book, I haven't alienated those readers because my goal is to make them feel less alone because I do think
Yeah.
that most parents have to have these skills and thought processes to support their family. So that's sort of where the book came from. So many times I would start a conversation with a parent in the office, like, your child has asthma or food allergies, and I'd have my 15 minutes with them, and then they would leave, and I would know that they had a lot of work ahead of them and figuring out how to
Yeah.
reconcile it with their life, but I couldn't support them all the way. So this is kind of the resource that I wish I had for those families.
I think what I appreciate so much is that you are giving names and definitions or differentiating between parenting and caregiving. That's something that I've struggled with a lot because like our life took a hard turn into caregiving. And so I really appreciate you making the distinction because I think people conflate the two. And I have this bone to pick with parenting narratives about how it works. It's like I'll see people talk about parenting in a certain way, but they don't talk about this parenting actually, right? Like in the media, in a lot of like kind of books of previous times, pre-COVID, we talk about parenting as like exactly what you're saying, kind of like the normal developmental things. But more and more what I found is that one, kids' needs are being a little bit more apparent. Like, kids have needs. Like, it's like a fundamental thing. I think we pretend that kids don't have needs. And two, there's just a lot going on with children. It feels like, COVID was and continues to be, the pandemic continues to be really hard on children. And so that skill set that you're talking about, I think, is important. And in the conversations I have in the lead up to launching Sleuth, it's amazing how many people privately messaged me to say, hey, this is going on with my kid. Hey, this is going on with my kid. Like, we're not getting answers. Um, and I would love to know what, from your perspective as a pediatrician, like what were those parents doing after they left your office? And like, what's the tool set that you want them to have?
Part of what I observed and part of what like motivated me to write this book was that when parents had been through it before, say they had an older child who had had something, even if it wasn't the same thing, they had earned these skills through lived experience, and they typically had an easier time navigating the systems and got their child better care. And that was particularly upsetting to me because it's, you shouldn't have to learn it the hard way, and you shouldn't have to um, you know uh, trial and error your way to parenting your child, especially when it matters so much to you as a parent. There should be more resources. Um, so that was one of the things that motivated me. And what I would say is, parents typically look to people they trust as the first
Mm.
line of support. So whether that's their family members, their friends, people in their immediate network. Um, Sometimes parents don't feel comfortable reaching out to them, either because
Mhm.
of all the feelings that come along with your child having a diagnosis. You know, the there's sometimes some stigma that parents face, feelings of shame, like maybe I did something to cause this. And there's also this need for like certainty and control. So like before talking to other people who love your child, you want to like know what you're going to tell them. So
Yeah.
parents hesitate to share, especially very early on, with the people they trust, which means that parents are kind of alone, like looking to figure out what to do if they're not talking to the people they trust. And so then they go online and they Google things, and they find a whole range, some very helpful resources, some very thoughtful social media groups that are more pro than con. Um, but they also might find some things that waste their time or scare them unnecessarily, or
Yeah.
give them bad information and lead them in the wrong direction. So, so I'd prefer that not happen.
Yeah. I hear you. I mean, I have a bone to pick with Dr. Google too. That's an inspiration for what we're doing, but it's a huge problem, right? Like how do you get information for different parts in your journey and how do you understand it? And I can't wait for your book to come out because I have a lot of personal questions. Like one question I asked our pediatrician last week was, so like when do we get to be done with therapy, right? Physical therapy and occupational therapy. Um, And I was, my daughter's situation, she went through early intervention. She's got multiple different interventions. I'm just like, and she's doing really well. And so in my identity as a parent, I have come to a place where I know that there's just going to be some things that she's not considered normal on, right? Like she's just going to take a long time eating compared to her peers because she has a swallow dysfunction, right? And then I'm like, but we've been doing this for like 6 years. So when do I just say, this is who she is and whatever? And she was like, no, you got to keep going. And I was like really shocked. Um, and how do you, like in your book, like how do you help parents understand where their kind of intuition is, but where we need data all the time, right? Like what do we do in those decision making process? Like what's your framework for that decision making?
I think this is such an important thing to talk about. And I think I had a very similar experience. I think, one of the only parents to ever like opt out of early intervention services for my child, because it was kind of similar. We were referred for something that it wasn't going well, the therapy, and I thought that I could do better on my own. And they were like, "But this is extra resources for your child. Why wouldn't you use these?" But the truth of the matter is that extra resources also come at a cost, whether it's a financial cost or a time cost or interrupting a child's nap or playtime. There's always a pro and a con to consider, even when you're doing something that is enriching for your child. So I think one of the most important parts of the framework is to prop parents up as like the experts on their family and on their child. They're the ones that know their child best, that see the pros and cons the clearest, in terms of their child's lived experience of what they're facing. And I think giving parents the confidence, because like you have a lot of education and knowledge and strength to like ask the questions to your providers, but I'll tell you that
Mhm.
not every parent does. A lot of times in these situations, parents can feel intimidated by the experts involved in their children's care and just kind of keep keep doing it, without pushing back or asking the questions about why and when and what's the bar. So one important part of it is giving parents the confidence to ask a lot of questions and to be the experts on their child.
Mhm.
And then another piece of it, there's a chapter about how you reconcile your family's priorities. And another piece of it is to think about those things that are really matter to your child, whether it's, the friendships or the free time or the extracurriculars or the sleep or whatever it is. Because sometimes when a parent and a doctor make a plan,
Mhm.
they center around the child's long-term health and development and academics and very grown-up topics, but they don't
Yeah.
always center around what matters for the child. So part of a parent's job in these decisions is to represent what matters to their child,
Yeah.
and I think that is neglected sometimes.
That's so interesting. Yeah. I mean, I've found that we've been forced to opt out of some of the like ways to be a successful parent narratives because we don't have the option. Like our Saturdays are we go to therapy. Like, like there's not that much time for extracurriculars. And like frankly, there's a part of it that's kind of liberating, right? Because it's really insidious, this like kids are have to succeed at this time. If you don't do this by the time they're 5, then this. And I think that centering the child is so reasonable. It's such a kind of like it makes total sense. But how do you ask the child? Like, can you tell us more about the child's voice and how we as caregivers, because sometimes I think we're kind of also a proxy for them when they're younger, and as
Mhm.
they get older, I'm sure that changes. I have young kids, so I don't have experience with that, but, like, can you tell us more about that?
Yes, obviously not every child can just sit down and have this mature discussion about what they care about and name their priorities and values. But a parent can observe what makes a child's eyes light up, what makes them smile, what when I was first starting out as a pediatrician, one of my mentors told me, never focus so much like on the hard times in a child's life that you forget to ask about the good days, because those moments where the child's really having a good day, the parts of their day that are the most pleasant for them, you also want to like lean into those things to make it, because that is what brings joy to a child's life. And so I
Yeah,
think it's really important to, even if your child can't tell you, to observe the
right.
parts of their day that are really pleasurable for them,
You
and
just know as a caregiver, as their parent, you have that intuition and bond.
you absolutely can tell. I've had patients in my practice who had very limited abilities to communicate,
Mhm,
and the parents always knew.
mhm. Oh, totally, totally. Um, to what extent has your own journey when you were a child kind of informed your work? Particularly, I guess, in complex care, which is actually, if you could talk more about what complex care is too, that would be very helpful.
Yes, yes. So complex care is kind of a new subspecialty in pediatrics that's been growing. Um, and basically what it is a recognition that children who have multiple medical conditions or rely on technology, often their care is sort of outside the comfort zone of a general pediatrician, and the care of a general pediatrician sometimes isn't set up in a way to best support these children's needs. So they might not have as long appointment times, as accessible an office, a social worker who helps with things like transportation or medical equipment. They might not have a nurse who can troubleshoot with technology or do some of the procedures required for kids who have equipment. And so, depending on where you live in the country, the models of complex care differ. In some states where it can be further physically from a children's hospital, they often take on the role of a consultant, and they kind of try to give the local doctor all the tools they can, like an annual plan and a care plan, and they're available, once a year to review how the kid is doing. In other areas like Boston and New York, and I know in Georgia they have one like this where the families come directly and get primary care from a complex pediatrician associated with a children's hospital, and that's the kind of program I was at. And part of why I went into pediatrics was because I like taking care of like whole people, and I liked that parents were like built-in advocates for the children. If you ever take care of adults, they don't always do what you tell them to, but you're a whole lot more likely to, like, as the doctor, get a parent to execute your plan than you are with adults. So I guess the other reason I went into pediatrics was because I had had cancer as a child, and I had some really wonderful role models in the field, and I saw how much they impacted the well-being of not just me but my family in navigating the challenges associated with having cancer. And I think that work of supporting the family, it's important work, and it's not always like well supported by the model of care that we have here. The insurance doesn't really reimburse, doctors for doing that work, but it is work that
Yeah.
has value. And I hope that complex care as a field can change that and do better for these families.
Yeah, totally. I mean, it's a unit. I think that's right. Like it's a family system.
Hmm.
And anyone in that system who is facing a challenge, it reverberates through the entire unit, right? And it causes kind of like you got to keep it stable. Um, so I appreciate that very much. I mean, I like we got a lot of help from child life specialists, for example. Like I feel like they were the people that I could tag in to give me support when my daughter was hospitalized. So I appreciate that a lot. Um, you know, what can when you are what do you what would you tell me as someone who has a young child who's going to grow up with kind of a history, a pretty robust medical history? I always wonder, What happens when they're grown? And like with kids in your practice, yourself, what are the things that we should know as parents that are earlier on the journey about what might change later in the journey? That's something that kind of haunts me, actually. Like, I don't know what I don't know in the future.
Yes. Well, part of what I would say is we know that the transition from being a child who has all your care handled by your parent to being an adult who handles all your own care, it doesn't happen quickly. And it's
Hmm.
probably really a process that can take 10 years. Um, and there's this incredible toolbox that I use with families. It's called the transition, but it kind of breaks it down into steps, like giving a child the skill of calling to make an appointment or negotiating with a pharmacy to get the medication they need. You know, I think one of the best ways to set your child up for success is to thoughtfully, when they're ready, give them more and more responsibility in their own care while still supporting them and supervising. And I think it's because it's not always so clear when a child is ready to take on their own care.
Mm.
And you also don't want errors to be made in the care, that parents tend to not give up that responsibility until it's very obvious that their child is ready, and then they just sort of hand it over and assume it will be handled.
Does
Uh,
that usually happen around college? Is that like the natural point?
Yeah, although parents, it depends obviously on a child's development and their
Hmm.
ability to maintain independence. But sometimes also in middle school and high school, kids are physically away from the parent for longer and longer stretches of their day, and they do have to take on some responsibilities for like vocalizing their symptoms or working with a school nurse or things like that. And so I think it should start, around 10 for a lot of kids.
Oh,
Is
wow.
is that's why part of the reason why we start as doctors talking to kids alone without their parents, just because you know it's a skill that you learn to feel comfortable, you learn to be honest, you learn to maybe say things that you might be embarrassed about or
Yeah.
that you don't want to talk about, and over time you get better at it. And the other piece of it is that as an adult, you know how hard it is to do something to take care of your own self every day. Like if you ever have had to take a medicine every day, or to remember to go for your own physicals every so often, or do your own healthcare maintenance stuff. Like we are generally not very good at it because it's hard. So when you do transition these responsibilities to your child, you need to like supervise them. So that supervision step is often what gets neglected, and that's when mistakes can happen.
That's fascinating. I never thought about that. There's like a component of children being independent that includes their health. I've thought about it from the point of view of like financial literacy, but I've never thought about it in terms of like health literacy. Um, and that seems actually very critical. Like we try to practice it a little bit with my younger one and, give options. And you had actually recommended a book to me called Afraid of the Doctor, right, for medical trauma, which I think also talks about that. Um, but I think that what you're saying about independence on health is actually has like really, really important long-term implications. Like, there's this whole conversation about women's health and all that. And I'm like, yeah, the most I ever went to the doctor was when I was pregnant. And now that I'm over 40, right? I never really took care of myself. But when I went to college, I was kind of, you go to college, whatever. And I still remember I had severe allergies as a kid. I used to get shots every week. And I hated it so much. It was just awful. And when I went to college, I think I was given like an ice box with a bunch of vials. And I'm like, I just like dropped it off to the nurse and like never went back. But I still suffered allergies. I'm just like, just didn't have that kind of internal motivation to go take care of it because it felt like a burden. So I find this actually really interesting. And my older daughter is 9. So this is something that I would like her to take seriously. Um,
Well, the plus side of it is when you encourage your child to be more independent, it's also like in line. I feel like most parents want their children to have high self-esteem and to think that they have control over their bodies, and like the ability to say no to things that
Yeah,
they don't want with their bodies. And so empowering your child to learn how to care for their body and to take ownership over their body, it's like very in line with those values. um,
totally.
but it does require something really uncomfortable, which is, as the parent, giving up like a little bit of control over something that's really important. And your child might want to do things differently than you do it, and so then you have to decide like how far you're willing to bend and where you'll meet. But sometimes in the long run, having your child have that feeling of ownership and buy-in might lead to a better place anyway.
Yeah. Yeah, yeah, for kids that are able to do that. Certainly there are kids that are not, right? With their development, it's just those transitions are harder for other reasons, right? And I
Absolutely.
and it's a lot of pressure, I think, on the parent because um, you're trying to meet your child at any moment about where they are and where you think they might be if, for example, you did a certain intervention. And that is kind of terrifying, because, at some point you're like, how much control do I really have on anything? But then on their day to day, you actually have a lot, actually. Like, I set up her trauma therapy, right? She does that on Wednesdays. Like, she's young enough to just go with whatever schedule she's given in that sense. But there was a time where I was not ready, for example, to have her start trauma therapy because, she had just gotten off the G tube and we were just getting off of the stress, right? It's like there's a dynamic between the caregiver's mental health and the child um, that does impact how everyone is taken care of. And I think that's really, for me, I found that really hard as a caregiver because I remember last year at this time, I was like, I know she needs medical trauma. I know she needs trauma therapy. And I was like, we're still in the acute phase. We got out of the hospital. We're still in the acute phase. We're still going through this. And I almost like sensed my way through it. Like, this sounds kind of weird, but I think this goes to the intuition component. I was like, it's not the right time. It's not the right time. And then it was like, boom, no, you got to do this now. And it's kind of I don't know what with like, you're such a proponent of parents and caregiver kind of being the expert. I don't know what you make of that kind of like intuition. Cause I think I almost want you to say like, yes, you don't have to do everything at once. And I think that's what I was asking my pediatrician last week, which was like, just give me permission to let something go, you know?
Yes, yes. No, I think it's really important. Something can be a valid use of time and a good thing to do, but still not the right thing to do right now. Like I know I need to exercise for my health, but like I also need to work and parent, and like so I can't do them both at the same time. So I'll have to do that one way.
Yeah.
Um, so I think what you said about the remembering the importance of caregiver wellness and parent wellness is really important,
Yeah.
because truthfully, from the pediatric, when I put in my like doctor hat, the well-being of the primary caregiver and the parent impacts the child so profoundly. And
Hmm.
so when you have too much on your plate and you're overstretched and overwhelmed, if you're not going to be making decisions as well as if you're like well rested and you're fed and hydrated, and you're like
Yeah.
thinking clearly. And so sometimes when I have families, like it sounds trite to be like, yes, you have to take care of yourself, but it's like you will be a more effective parent if you take care of yourself. Is
That's
there?
such an important second line to that. I think that hits so much more, right? It's like,
Mm-hmm,
oh, I will be better for my child. Because otherwise, I think a lot of us can say, no, but my child is first. We don't think about the system or the dynamic. We
mm-hmm.
think about it's okay if I'm depleted. I just have to make sure that they have everything they need. Um, which is, yeah, it's a really interesting. I was never like that, actually. Like, I totally get that. Like, everything for the kid, like, you run yourself ragged and you're tired. But I do see so clearly that the space that we make in our home impacts the kids more than anything. So if it's stressful, they're stressed. If it's joyful, they're calm, right? If it's chill, they're healing. And it's a dynamic that I think I've learned literally just from experience, not because I kind of knew that with like the parenting guidance that I did read. It's like it's very strange, I think, actually, that it's not um, more known, right? That like you have to take care of yourself first.
Yes, yes. It's interesting. One of my friends, when I was a new parent, had said something to me about how for her, um, her marriage comes before her kids. And at the time, I remembered being like, that doesn't feel like me. But now that I have like a little bit more of a mature perspective on it, like to have that solid family home base, you know, and that partner in parenting your children, of course that would be important.
Right, right. And any family structure, like your relationships or like your friendships or whatever, like
Mhm.
being strong for yourself because it goes down. I mean, I think that also speaks to the fact of like the areas that we think we have control, we might have less control over. Um, I want to ask you you mention in the book, for example, like the kids that have food allergies or ADHD or things that are unexpected. What is in the very early moments when a parent is like, I think that there's something that my child is experiencing that I need to help them with? What do you usually give as advice in that moment in terms of like helping them see that this might not be a short-term thing, it might be a long-term thing? How do you kind of gear them up and keep them calm?
Yes, I think one important first step is to think about the bigger picture. So if your child has something that's affecting them in some settings, to think about other settings, right? So if there's a problem at school, is it really just at school, or is it also affecting home? Or
Yeah.
is it really a new problem, or has it been there for a while? If you sort of like zoom out and think about the bigger picture, you can also remember that there might be other parts of your child's life that are going well. So even though they are facing something that's impacting them, they might have strengths and positive parts of their life that are also
Yeah.
important to remember. That it's not like everything is in disarray. It's like there's one thing that is important and needs follow up and will be followed up, but it's part of a
Yeah.
big system, like you said.
Yeah, I guess it's so hard to remember that because we think of school as so central to everything. Even with when you think about friendships, or you think, oh, but school friendships. But then it's like you realize that there's this whole life outside of it that they experience as well. And I fall into that a lot. Um, Trying to optimize like one thing. I actually found myself um it's like they'll get report cards and I'll say, I've really had to kind of hone my messaging around it. And one of my children is like she's very competitive with herself. And I used to say, no, it doesn't matter. Like, you're fine or whatever. And I was coached by a child psychologist actually to say, no, like, it's important to her, actually. Like, she's if she feels competitive, you gotta go where she is. You can't do a counter message to what they're saying. You kind of have to go with them. And I think that helped me see where they were in different parts of their life. Like, how are they at home? Like, how are they at school? How are they at the mosque? Like, how are they with their family? And it's just like that whole picture. They experience the wholeness of life. And I know that with that, particularly with my older, when she was younger, she definitely had restraint collapse when she came home. Like, she would hold it in at school, right?
Yeah,
And then she would literally just like fall apart as soon as she walked in.
yeah,
So it's funny what we notice, like in our kids based on, I don't know what it's based on. Um, but is there anything you would want, like, what do you want parents to know that are facing? Like, if you could give them 3 points of advice, like about the unexpected, what do you wish you could equip us with? Whether or not we're dealing with it now, or we don't know what's coming down the line.
Yeah. Yes. I think one is to remind parents that they are the leader of the family.
Yeah.
So along with being the leader, comes responsibility, obviously, to get everything done, but also comes an opportunity to sort of set the tone and to set the boundaries and the expectations for your child. And so there's a little bit of like how you package your child's challenge, which will be how they view their challenge too. So to be intentional in assuming those leadership responsibilities for your family would be one piece of advice. The second would be to know that you are the expert on your child and that you're like the perfect person to be parenting your child through this. I think a lot of times people, especially people who might not be very well versed in the health and educational jargon and systems, they might feel like out of their depth when supporting their family, um, in doing this research and all this work of like interacting with the care systems. But like the problem is not you as a parent. The problem is like the systems aren't easy to deal with. Um, so I think that's important to remember as you try to maintain your confidence in getting these resources for your family.
Yeah, sorry, go on.
Yeah. Yeah. Oh, and then the last one I was going to say, which, is part of like the mission of writing advanced parenting, is just to remember that you like aren't alone in facing the challenge. That I think what happens when something unexpected happens is most parents like try to put on their minders and figure their way out of the situation. And it can be very isolating, and it makes it worse to feel alone in it. But when you remember that even if maybe others around you haven't dealt with the exact same thing, like most people have dealt with something, or when I've been talking to people about this book, everybody has at least one person where they're like, I know somebody who needs this, who I'm close with right now. I would like to give it to them. And I'm like, because everybody has stuff. So like, don't feel alone.
Yeah. Yeah. Um, well, on those 2 points, which I hit very close to home, the advocacy and not feeling alone, what are, um, like, do you have any tactical tips on the advocacy? Like, when you're with the doctor and there's a parent who's either concerned about their child or their child just has a diagnosis or something that's going on, like, how do they actually advocate in front of the doctor and specialist for what they want?
Yes. So I think one piece of it is kind of preparing for the visit,
Yep.
either thinking through like what information you want to share and why. So
Okay.
you don't leave out like important information. Then thinking about like what your goal of the interaction is, whether it's like, decisions that you want help making or questions that you want addressed. Um, and if possible, to whether rather than waiting for that part of the visit where the doctor says, is there anything else? Like, it's better to say, like, oh, hi, nice to see you. I'm really hoping that before I leave today, we can get this addressed. Because in my experience as a doctor, people often will wait until you're like about to leave the room. And then they're like, this is why I'm actually here. We didn't get to this. And you're like, wait a minute. Like, that's a whole, I thought
Yeah.
you were here for this. And that sort of miscommunication can waste people's time. And like,
Yeah.
it can be really frustrating as a parent and a patient too, because like you think you're there to do something that might not get addressed. So to say like, hi, good to see you. It's really important that before I leave today, I have a plan for helping my child sleep.
Yeah.
We haven't slept in 2 months. It's like, oh, okay, we'll start there.
Yeah, it's almost like back to your point about the leadership thing, that like you're leading this conversation with the doctor, like the doctor isn't the only one leading the conversation, right? And like I always make the assumption that you would have seen several patients before me. So like I know my child's health history between appointments probably better than you do, right? Because I'm the parent, right? And so like what's the most effective way to share that, right? Whether it's like tracking the child's symptoms, like having notes, like having a journal of what they ate or how they sleep. Um, like we're pulling out your phone and showing them blood work, which is what I did yesterday. Like those kind of tips and tricks, they feel so informal, right? I think a lot of us don't do it because we just assume the system works the way it's supposed to work and we just show up. Like I think a lot of us show up passively, but for anyone who's been on a journey, a health journey, they know it's actually the active participation that gets better results for everyone, for the doctor and the child. So it's I'm just thinking back to so many stories I've heard from other moms who are like and you hear this more than me, which is it is like I started off kind of just hearing the information and then something happened and I realized that I'm also in the driver's seat, and then I started and like getting all my tools and tips together. So it's very resonant. On the feeling alone point, where can parents, like, where are you finding that your parents go to feel less alone? What are those things or there's options or there's ways to communicate?
Yeah, it's interesting. I mean, social media has a lot of potential to connect people in positive ways, especially if you're facing a rare diagnosis and might not know anybody else with that in your immediate community. But another piece of it that I find, when things are going well, people really like blast it out with their networks. But when things aren't going well, they're very hesitant to share broadly for many reasons, many valid reasons. But but what I would say is that the more people share with their people, the more support they will get. So
Hmm.
for unfortunately for something like a child with a mental health challenge, um, it, there's not a lot of like meal trains that show up when your child is depressed, but that doesn't mean there shouldn't be, and that doesn't mean that people who have had loved ones that are depressed don't want to help somehow if they know what you're dealing with, or they you know so when you make your challenge more visible to those that you trust in your community, um, you might be surprised by the help that you can get and the support you can get.
Yeah.
It takes a little bit of bravery.
Yes. Yes, it does. Um, I love that example. You're so right. We still kind of don't associate mental health with other things. So my last question is, what should I have asked that I didn't ask? What did I miss?
Gosh, I think we got through a lot of it. Yeah, I think the other kind of fun thing, obviously it's hard. It's all hard. But one um, one thing I talk about some in the book that is worth mentioning is that when you face a challenge, either as a child or as a parent, it's also like an opportunity to grow. And also when
Yeah.
there's healthy siblings in the home who are kind of affected by their siblings challenge, um, parents can feel guilty about the resources that are being taken away from them. But even that experience is also a chance to grow, and sometimes it's nice to remind folks that these growth experiences, some people develop more empathy, some people develop more compassion, they develop more thoughtful approaches to the way that they behave and interact. They learn skills. Like sometimes, even in these very difficult moments, like unexpected good things come from it. So just to remind people of that.
I love that. I feel that so much. So much things that I didn't expect in like bad ways happen, but there's been so much beautiful, amazing things in our family and my daughter and both my kids. So I really, really appreciate you saying that because I think the narrative that we create for our families is hugely important. So thank you for your time, Dr. Fradin. Please, everyone, order her book. It's going to be amazing. Mine is on its way when it gets released. So I think that what you're doing is really kind of getting to the next level of parenting advice, and it's so needed. And I know it's going to help so many people. So thank you for writing it, basically.
Thank you so much.
And we will talk soon.
Okay.